No one questions whether COVID has had an impact on our collective mental health. It has. New Westminster's Stacy Ashton, Executive Director of the Crisis Centre of BC, has lots to say about how personal crises develop and how calling the crisis line can help.
My understanding is in the US, and I don't know if this is in Canada, before COVID, suicides were ramping up. Is that true, like over the years?
It's the suicide statistic is a tricky one when you get into it. Statistically speaking, suicide is a relatively rare event. So, you know, it's in a province of millions, it'll be, you know, 100 people will die by suicide. Now those deaths are very significant. Like they take people out of our lives who are parents and kids, and you know, they have a huge ripple effect. So they're very significant. What we find though is that feeling suicidal and having suicidal actions or attempts is much more common than suicide itself. So the level of misery and sadness and despair that drives suicide is about that drives about 20% of our calls to the crisis line. Right. So when I look at the costs of that level of despair, it's taken in lives, but it's also just taken in the grind of being alive through those kinds of difficult periods of time or difficult mental illnesses that create those kinds of feelings in people. And so, that we've been seeing that we've been seeing help seeking for when people are in distress really climb over the last 10 years. So it climbs far faster than the population does.
Does anything stand out for a reason for that?
Well, a huge reason for that is that the work that we're doing in destigmatizing mental health is really working. So a lot of people are more willing to reach out for help because they know that help is available, and it feels okay to reach out. We're a private place, we're a confidential space, so there isn't the same level of fear or risk as it would be if you were telling a friend or somebody that you care about that you're struggling. But the comfort level, like the people's willingness to call what they would think of as a stranger and talk to them about their problems is much higher now than it would have been even 20 years ago. So that's driving a lot of it, which is really good, because that's what it takes to get the help that people need, the willingness to talk about it and reach out.
Are you finding the same is true for you know, traditional cultural ethnic groups, for example, the Chinese, the Punjabi, you know, people that tend to not want to connect with anybody. In fact, they don't even like to you know, admit to their own family that they're having these feelings. So are you finding any, I mean, maybe you don't do that kind of statistics, but do you know if there's any kind of uptick in terms of the ethnic population?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's because there are very strong, dedicated destigmatizing campaigns going on in the South Asian community, in the Vancouver area, and in the Chinese community in the Vancouver area. There's a lot of outreach happening to normalize depression and anxiety and you know, negative feelings, and connect people up to their family doctors or to mental health professionals or to the crisis lines. There's a couple of crisis lines. There's a Chinese language crisis line. There's a South Asian crisis line. So there's some specialized crisis lines to respond to that, and that can make people, it's interesting. For some people, they prefer using a line that will connect them with somebody, you know, from their community, and others prefer to use the general crisis line because the communities are smaller and there's a chance that you might know the person who is volunteering on those lines. So yeah, but it's a lot of work, and so we are seeing an increasing number of people from, and certainly in by second generation, we're seeing a lot of people willing to reach out for help.
Yeah, well, that's good news. So COVID came along, and then what happened?
Well, COVID came along, and it's been quite the year. We were braced for our call numbers to go up, and they remained steady for a couple of weeks, and then in mid-March we went into isolation and quarantines, and by mid-April we'd seen our lines were trending 30% over what we would normally be taking, and on average it stayed up around 25%. So if we were getting 130 calls a day, we were getting, some days it would be 180, some days it would be 240 calls. It was and a huge variation day to day. So that's one of the pieces about being a crisis line, is you never actually know what the day is going to bring.
Yeah. So what is the demographic? Is it elderly people? Is it young people? Or is it just all over the map?
Everybody. The thing is, like, crisis happens in everybody's life, right? You can't get out of being a human without taking some bruises along the way. And so we do get calls from all, from children age to seniors to every age in between. We've seen, it's pretty steady across the whole age range.
So children too, so that they can phone as opposed to kids help phone, and anybody can.
Anybody can phone. It depends on what numbers that you've been getting from your teachers or your school. Right. We also have a youth chat service, so that's open from noon to 1 a.m. and so we have connections through that, because youth tend to prefer using chat. Well, that's a really big generalization. A lot of young people also prefer using phone for crisis calls, because one of the reasons for that is it's hard to know if somebody is paying attention to you on a chat, but you have somebody's undivided attention when they're talking to you on the phone. Right.
Interesting. So then the people that you have working or volunteering for you, they have to be pretty well trained, I would imagine.
Oh yeah. We do about 130 hours of training. A whole bunch of training, about 50 hours before we get you on the lines, and then the rest is training while you are learning how to take calls and being supported.
So now there's a whole bunch of risk factors that's related to this whole COVID thing, like economic loss, fear of getting COVID or to have a family member. I mean, my kids are more worried about me getting COVID than I am.
Yeah.
Living in close quarters, et cetera, et cetera. What stands out for you? Are all of these things pretty common issues?
Well, yeah. I mean, what we're finding, so often when you're in crisis or you're really having a difficult time, it's not because one thing went wrong, it's because 5 things went wrong. So COVID is that reliable 5th thing that goes wrong that makes everything else more difficult. So if you're struggling with your relationships with your kids, COVID's not helping that. If you've lost your job, COVID's not making it any easier to get a new one. And the isolation is really difficult. It means that a lot of the connections that we rely on to kind of take the edge off of the hard feelings that we have, or the difficult things we have to go through, are not as available. And as COVID and the isolation has gone on for a longer period of time, people are more concerned about talking to their friends about their problems, because their friends have problems. And that's where we can be a real relief valve for people, is, you can contact us and we have the bandwidth, we have the capacity to hear what you're going through and listen and help you unpack it in a way that if all of the people around you are in the same boat, it can be harder.
Right. Now, isolation, I would imagine, is pretty hard for the people in the 20s and maybe early 30s, more so than, people that are kind of got themselves kind of well planted in their life, and there's nothing else added to that. Like they're not losing their job, they're just working at home or whatever. Is that what you found at all? That the 20-year-old cohort? Or is that no?
Yeah, well, for people in their 20s and 30s, it's particularly challenging because that doesn't tend to be a time in your life where you're economically stable. It doesn't tend to be a time in your life where you settle down. You know, you're much more likely to be have a network of friends that you want to connect with, and you're more, you know, so it creates a whole bunch of challenges, economic and social. And there, yeah, so, but you know, everybody is having their own experience with COVID.
Right.
So it's really difficult to generalize across an age group. You know, if you are in your 30s and 40s and you're single, or you know, you're likely going to be isolated. You know, if you're somebody who had a steady work and now you're working from home instead of the office, a lot of, you know, 80% of your socialization happens at work and now doesn't. So it's you know, and if you are a senior, you're not seeing your grandkids, you're not seeing your kids. It's for all kinds of reasons, humans have a really hard time with not being able to connect with the people that they care about. And that's been true across the whole age range through COVID.
Yeah, we're social animals. It is. And it's and as time goes on, I would imagine it's harder and harder. I feel it, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm pretty much an introvert, but by now I'm getting, okay, this is enough.
Yeah. Yeah. And we are right now, we're seeing our calls begin to spike again. And generally on the crisis lines, when there's a kind of a period of transition, so September, we'll see a spike in calls because, you know, people's lives tend to change from summer to the fall, and change is very stressful. So, and not all of those changes go well. So that drives a lot of crisis and distress calls. In the same way, as we transition to what do you do now that you have a vaccination? You know, what does it mean to get back into community and to reconnect with your friends, and to, you know, there's a lot of happiness there. There's a lot of stress there. There's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of change. And that's hard. It's hard. People get overwhelmed. It's normal to be overwhelmed. And I mean, you know, we can call ourselves the crisis line, or we can call ourselves the overwhelmed line.
Yeah.
Right?
So I call you and I say, I'm overwhelmed.
Yeah.
What do you tell me?
Honestly, what we would generally do is, wow, you sound overwhelmed. Right? Because what we're doing, especially in the initial part of the call, is just helping you talk about it, right? So you'll tell us how you feel, right? Like, what is overwhelming you?
Yeah.
And you'll tell us, well, you know, like, I don't know what to do about my parents, like, you know, what's happening with them and my kids and like all of these things, and I just lost my job, and you know, that sounds really stressful. And those kinds of reflective questions just help prompt somebody. So one of the things that can be different talking to us as opposed to a friend is a friend will often jump in and go, well, have you tried this? Or what if you did that? Or it can't be that bad. Or, oh, I had that happen to me last week. And it's, you know, that it's hard to get people to just listen. And what we find is that if you give people the opportunity to just talk through how they're feeling, that by itself reduces your distress hugely. And so one of the things that always impresses me is the average crisis line call takes about 12 minutes.
Oh,
so, right? You'd think, like, you know, like when you're in the moment, right? You're like, this is like, I have enough pain in me to go for hours. But really, you know, like 6 or 7 minutes of dedicated listening. And at that point, you're like, okay, now I'm starting to repeat my emotions, and I'm feeling calmer. So then the conversation often naturally goes to, well, what do you want to do about all of this, you know, this complicated problem that you've outlined here. And then, the questions, the answers can start to come. And we don't give answers. We've just known you for literally 8 minutes.
Right.
We're not going to tell you what you should do with your life, but we're going to listen to you figure it out. And then if you say, like, we can offer some ideas, like, have you thought about going to a doctor if there seems to be a physical, like, often if you're depressed or anxious, there's trouble with your eating, there's trouble with your sleeping. Those are usually indicators that going to a doctor and talking about that might lead to some helping, some practical help. Or do you need to talk to a lawyer, or do you want to talk to a counselor about this? But at the end of the day, our job is done when you feel back in control of your own life.
Right. And that
So
you have
do with that
you developed
control
some ideas about what you can do.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah. And if you go away and you do completely different other things, that's fine. You are in control of your life. That's the whole point. You felt like you weren't, and now you feel like you do. And if you feel like you aren't again, you call us back and we'll get you back to feeling in control of your life. Like you're at least feel like, okay, I this is hard, this is horrible, I don't like what's happening right now, but I can go forward, I can get through this.
Right. Now, one of the things that kind of worries me is that I think often, like I've had known examples of people end up committing suicide because they've been drinking too much, or they've had drugs and they're drinking, or something like that, something that kind of lowers their inhibitions about doing stuff. Is that an area of concern for you, for people answering the phones?
Well, it's something that we would assess along with a whole bunch of other things that we would assess. So if we have a caller call us and they tell us they're feeling suicidal, generally what we're going to look for is, first of all, one of the things we look for is the reasons why they're still alive, like what's keeping them going. And often you find out that they have connections or people that they love, and they just say, I want to do this, but I'm not going to because of all of these reasons. And that's really helpful for us to know. And then we want to know if you have access to a means to kill yourself. And so we'll find out about that, and we'll try and do is get you to be farther away from this thing. Right. Throw the pills out, put things, as like away from a bridge, those kinds of things.
Right.
Because the in that moment, what you're wanting to do is help people have other choices. Right. Make the suicide choice less attractive, and make other choices more possible. Right. Because if you can get to a person where, it's, I feel like this way forever, or I die by suicide, and you'll go, I die by suicide, or actually I can take a semester off school. Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, then you could take a semester off school. It's not the end of the world. Like when you're tunnel vision, well, I might as well die if I take the semester off school. And so a lot of it can be, a lot of people take the semester off school. You can do that. It's okay. If that's what you want to do, let's figure that out. So, so that's where, so it's, I can't remember what precisely you asked now, but I'm kind of trying to get at that it's a process. Like, so if you're drinking or you have drugs, then that's kind of a part of what's going on for you. And, and sometimes you can talk to people and say, well, do you want to make this decision when you're drunk? How about we, part of what you can do is you're buying time. And one of the concerns is certainly with the opioid addictions and the opioid overdoses, people are not intending to die when they take drugs, but it can still happen.
Well, I imagine those people are not the ones that are calling you, because they wouldn't be, or maybe they are. I mean, maybe.
We have some, but not a lot. It's like if you are, I think, having an overdose and you're able to reach out and call for help, 911 is better, because it's like otherwise you're calling us and we're calling 911 and you've lost a few seconds there. So you really encourage people who are actually in the middle of an overdose to just call 911 directly and get themselves get to a hospital so they can get proper treatment. We have to be prepared for anything.
Now, if I phone you and or one of your people and I say I'm standing on a bridge and I've got my foot on the railing, I'm thinking about jumping over, what would you do?
Well, we actually we answer the bridge phones too. So you might actually have called us on one of the dedicated
Oh,
phones
so
that
there
are
are bridge
on
phones.
the bridge. Yeah. So there are phones that people can call from. And typically what we'll do is, you know, we'll be really glad you called, because calling is different than actually jumping.
Right,
And the fact that you called is a good indicator that you don't want to jump, that
right,
you want to have a conversation. So then we
right,
would be having a conversation.
right.
If we ideally we want to work with people, and often we are able to, like 98% of our calls, we're able to work with somebody to figure out what they can do to keep themselves safe, or
Mhm,
what we can bring into the situation that will
mhm,
keep them
mhm.
safe, or negotiate getting them to a hospital and contacting
Right,
911 to do that.
right,
And then in some cases where, you know, we're just really sure that we've come to the end of what we can do on the phone, we'll contact 911 and make sure that
okay,
they're on their way. And yeah, so
okay.
we do save lives that way. And yeah, it's
Now, that's really interesting. Like, I didn't know there was phones on bridges. I know that some bridges have been made in such a way that suicide's not an easy thing to accomplish.
yeah.
I'm not sure all. What else is there happening in society that is there to help people? Are there other things as well that are just part of the infrastructure, or whether soft or hard?
It's hard to get like a full overview of everything that's
Right,
happening in the mental
right,
health and mental wellness
right,
space.
right.
But if I think about schools, then we do a lot of work in the schools talking
Oh, okay.
about tools for managing crisis and distress, right?
Right,
Really normalizing big, painful feelings as
right.
something that everyone is experiencing, and then working through, okay, well, what do you do with those feelings? Because,
Yeah,
you know, I don't remember when I was growing up anybody ever teaching me how to handle my
yeah,
unmanageable emotions,
yeah, yeah,
aside from stop crying.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I was,
Is it really that bad?
I learned how to bottle up.
Yeah, yeah,
But we are teaching people and helping, especially young teenagers, so in those like
right,
13 to 18 years old,
right,
where, you know, your hormones are driving some very big feelings,
yeah, yeah,
right? Like, what do these big feelings mean? How do you understand them? How do you cope with them?
right,
How do you run yourself, instead of letting your emotions run
right,
you?
right.
So we do a lot of that kind of work.
Oh,
And
that's great.
and part of that is about, like, like,
Yeah,
some feelings are too big to handle on your own, and that's okay. So
yeah,
places that you can go for help, you can call us, you can, like, who, and get people to self-identify as well.
yeah,
Who are the people that you trust in your life? That when you have these big feelings, you feel like, even though it's scary, you can probably go and talk to them about it.
right. Okay, that is so great. I mean, certainly in my time, which is way before your time, it was stiff upper lip. My daughter especially tends to know people that have suicidal ideation, and then every time she sort of gets a clue that something's going on Facebook, she'll phone 911 and tell them to go to somebody's house, what the address.
Mhm.
And of course, with all this concern about, police that are not accompanied with mental health professionals, um, that may not be the best people to have go and visit. I mean, is this a concern for people?
It is, and we work closely. We're working closely now with police and with 911 to look at what alternatives are available, to a police response. A lot of what we do in our work in building safety plans with people on the phone is diversion from police response.
Right,
Police response still may need to happen in situations.
Right.
And there are pilots that are coming together that are that look at pairing a plainclothes officer with a mental health professional, or a plainclothes person with even with a cell phone that you can
Right.
FaceTime with a
Right.
mental health professional to get support. Because a part of it is the stigma of having your police show up at your door that can
Right.
do things like destabilize your housing
Right.
because you're seen
Right.
as a problem tenant, all kinds of
Right.
things that
Right.
that are, as well as just being in and of themselves really scary and traumatizing for people.
Yeah.
The goal that we always have when we're dealing with somebody who is feeling suicidal is to like people will feel suicidal when they feel like the only thing that they have left in their life that they can control is whether they take their life or not.
Right.
And so
Right.
if you take their control away by having the police show up and take you against your will to the hospital, you haven't addressed that that control problem. And it isn't necessarily the thing that is the best thing to do. So we're actively, as a community and as a crisis center, looking at different pilots and models, and that's been really that's probably been the best thing to come out of the media work and the
Right.
conversation, the public
Right.
conversation we're having, and the Police Act reform that's going on in the provincial government, to really
Okay.
look at this and go, well, is this the best solution, or can we do other things as well?
Yeah. Now, are you aware at all what's happening with the New West Police? Are they in discussion about this kind of thing? Do you know?
Yeah, oh yeah, everyone is. So yeah, I
Okay.
think they have a committee going right now that is looking at what they would like to submit to the Police Act Reform Committee in terms of what New West feels would be best. We have our own police force. The New Westminster Police is a municipal force, so they have
Right.
they would put in their own submission, and they've been like the New West Police has a mental health liaison officer.
Oh,
They the Royal Columbian is part of our community, and the
right.
Royal Columbian, it has a very large psychiatric department
Right.
and a lot of mental health services attached to it. So we do have a lot of people in our community
Right.
who who sometimes have mental health illnesses that can lead them into disruptions and to contact that will with
Right.
police.
Right.
So the idea is to make those contacts as positive as possible.
Right. And I would imagine people with mental health issues, that's all being exacerbated by COVID-19, their issues, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of mental illnesses thrive on isolation, and like a lot of the things that you do to keep yourself healthy and well, access to exercise, access to friends,
Right. Right.
a sense of security.
Right.
It's the reality of COVID can undermine that. Even in some, even the piece of, if you're afraid to go outside, well, now there are other reasons to be afraid to go
Right.
outside. So
Right.
it can drive that
Yeah.
further isolation. And for a little while, it was, there was a little bit of a blip in how easy it was to access mental health services, as everyone across the province was figuring out how to do things remotely.
The police are putting together an idea of what they want to do, and they're submitting it to what, the provincial government? Is that who they're submitting it?
Well, right now, the Police Act Reform Committee, they've had several rounds of submissions. So they've already had some rounds of submissions specifically from police and
Right.
specifically from mental health teams.
Okay.
And now there's an open submission that's also happening, where people
Okay.
are adding to their submissions, or like the crisis center will be putting in a submission
Right.
that kind of outlines what we see as some of the challenges and opportunities
Right.
around police involvement in mental health issues.
Right. And so this is submitted to whom? It's like, is this a provincial body that it's submitted to, or the health authority, or?
It's a parliamentary committee. So so it's a parliamentary committee, which means it's the MLAs. The MLAs are a working group of MLAs are involved in looking through, because they're looking at revamping the legislation. So
Okay.
that's what they're right now is kind of the public
Right.
process that
Right.
of informing that, you know, and the Police Act has not been reformed in any significant way in quite a while. So there's a lot to look at.
Well, that's good news, isn't it? One question I was going to ask, how would I determine that my closed mouth husband, mine isn't, but you know, somebody who's kind of doesn't like to speak about what they're feeling and so on, or my teenager, what would be the signs that would indicate to me that maybe I should, you know, kind of get them sorted to go somewhere, to a doctor or something?
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that you might see are a change in behavior is one of the ones, and that can go either way. It can either go from somebody being really taciturn and disconnected, that's kind of, you know, normally very introverted or contained, to being, you know, very connected, and because there can be a piece for people who, once they've made a decision that they're going to die, they want to leave all of their loved ones with good memories of them. So changes in behavior that can be an indicator, and then of course, like becoming more withdrawn and isolated, not doing activities that you used to enjoy, right? So, you know, you love tennis, but now you just don't want to do tennis anymore. That can be a sign that something's up. Changes in appetite, changes in weight. So and you know, and especially if there's been something that's happened, like a job loss, or you know, or you know, a relationship loss, or a huge change in your life, and it's worthwhile at those points to, you know, to check in with that person. And one of the things that we train people to do, both in our professional training for people who are first responders or counselors or school counselors, and with youth and individuals, like regular individuals in the community, is just flat out ask, right? I've noticed these changes. Are you thinking about killing yourself?
Okay,
You
interesting.
know, and just put it out there. It's the biggest gift you can do for someone who actually is feeling suicidal, because the feeling of being suicidal feels shameful and scary, and like no one will understand. And so you can be very alone in feeling suicidal. And as soon as somebody asks you, and is willing to hear the answer, that you're no longer alone with those feelings.
But I'm sure there are don'ts. I'm sure there are don'ts here, like don't try and fix it so much as, you know.
I mean, the best thing next is to just listen, like, wow, that sounds like it's really scary. And then they'll tell you, hopefully, and then the idea then is, okay, well then what do we need to do? Because you know, it's not good for you to be feeling this way. This sounds horrible. So how do we want to be like, so sometimes, you know, a person who is feeling suicidal would be like, I want to talk to you, but I don't want to talk to anyone else because this is super private. But that doesn't really help the person. Because you want to be able to, and it's fine to say, you know what, this is too big for me to handle just by myself. I want to bring in other people, because like the whole point here is to keep you safe. If I want to keep you safe, I want to keep you here. But I don't want you to have to feel this way, because it's terrible. So, you know, let's look at who else we can involve. And so you don't want to promise to keep a secret, and it's fine if you can't get a total agreement from somebody to talk. You still want to be broadening the circle of support around this person.
So when you say broadening the circle of support, are you talking about professionals only? Or are you talking about like friends and family?
Friends and family, you know, like if there are trusted people in that person's life, then it's good for them to know. It's good for them to know that their loved one is struggling. And, you know, a family doctor can be really helpful. A counselor can be really helpful. The crisis lines can be really helpful. So, you know, it's like you could say, like, I don't know what to do next, but I know there's a crisis line. So why don't we call them together? And so we'll get calls like that are a friend and somebody they're worried about calling together, or
Right.
you can call the crisis line and say, I'm worried about this person. So
Right.
like what you were saying with your daughter, instead of calling 911, you can call us and we'll do a outreach call from the
Okay.
crisis line. So instead
Okay.
of immediately sending a police response, we can talk to that person and
Right.
say, we got a call
Right.
from your friend. They're very concerned about you.
Right.
You know, have you been thinking about suicide? Let's talk about your safety. Is there anything
Right.
that we can do to help? And so we do a lot of those kinds of calls as well.
Yeah. Well, it's good to know that suicide's pretty rare.
Yeah, like the feelings, like one of the things that's really important to know is just because you have a feeling that you want to die doesn't mean you actually want to die.
Right.
And it doesn't mean you're going to die. In
Right.
fact, most of the time it doesn't mean that at all.
Right.
It means you need to get more help. It means that,
Right.
you know, the coping you have available to you for whatever reason just isn't enough right now. And
Right.
that's okay. We're
Right.
not meant to go through life completely self-contained and being able
Right.
to handle everything just by ourselves.
Right.
So the trick is to make sure that you have
Yeah.
the support you need so that you can get through difficult times.
Yeah.
But I mean, we're still suicide, you know, I don't want to minimize the fact that people do die by suicide, and it is something that that can happen, and that we really want to make sure that people have an opportunity to reach out for help before they make that kind of a decision or feel like that's their only option.
Yeah. Yeah. So any advice for people that are feeling kind of feeling like they're in this dreadful situation right now? And largely because COVID has just added things on, like just getting through that next few months. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, reach out for help. It's okay to be feeling crappy. It's pretty normal to be feeling crappy at this for most people in this kind of a circumstance.
Yeah.
And even if everything in your life looks amazing and perfect, and anybody from the outside would be like, you have great kids and, you know, a great job and everything is perfect, and you feel crappy and sad and horrible, that's real. That's real. That's there is no should in feelings.
Right.
There's just what is.
Right.
And if you're able to stop beating yourself up for feeling bad and instead be curious and go, well, what am I going to do about this?
Yeah.
Because no one expects you to spend your life suffering.
Right.
Right. Like that is not good for you, and it's not good for anybody. So if there, it can be very painful to reach out for help and start confronting really painful feelings.
Right.
But it is a pathway through them.
Right. Right.
And that's really what we want to encourage people to know, is that there are pathways. There are pathways through really sad, terrible things.
Right.
And really heavy, painful feelings. And you are not the only one who has felt the way you're feeling.
Right.
Ever.
Well, and then there's the fallout. Like somebody, you know, commits suicide, and then there's the fallout for the family, which is horrendous. You know.
It's it is a very hard way to lose somebody, because what happens is you've lost that person, you have that immediate grief and loss, but you also, you know, 10 years later, you're aware that they just missed their grandchild graduating.
Right. Right.
Right. Or they just, you know, and that whatever it was that was going on for them 10 years ago is so insignificant now. Right. Compared to what it would be to have them here to watch their grandchild graduate.
Right.
So it's a loss and an absence that that doesn't go away.
Yeah.
You know, you can still, as a person who's lost a loved one to suicide, have a fulfilling, joyful life with people that you love. And also that person is always absent.
Right. Right. Yeah. So you're always going to deal with the pain of that, but there's joy. That's part of life too.
Yeah. You know,
but
you're left with the memory of that person, but you don't get to know them as they grow and change,
Right.
because they aren't doing that anymore.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I think the immediate effect on the family is, what could I have done? What did I miss? I think it's very,
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
difficult.
Yeah. Is there anything else I could have done? And that's the one of the real tragedies of suicide is that there's so much ambivalence for people in the moment that they decide whether they're going to live or die, that you can change your mind, in a heartbeat, and even like the smallest thing can
Right.
derail you, right?
Right.
So because like, at the same time as you want to escape this pain, you also want to live,
Right.
and
Right.
and so if you might expect that your parents are going to be home at a certain time, but
Right.
then they're later, and
Right.
so you were gambling that probably they would find you before you
Right.
died,
Right.
but they came home later,
Right.
right? And if they'd come home earlier, you probably would have lived,
Right.
because and that's the
That's
thing,
very
that's why we get calls, is because people are, I want to die, but I want help.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, this is it's a very interesting conversation. I learned a lot. Thank you. That's great.
Yes,
Is there anything else that you want to get across to
a lot.
people?
I think just that idea of having compassion for yourself, and because it's hard for all of us. I have a hard time being compassionate with myself. I think possibly one of the hidden benefits of COVID is we've all had to become more compassionate with ourselves, because and there is kind of more of a collective okayness with
Right.
like the idea that you have to drive
Right.
and just
Right.
keep going.
Right.
COVID kind of made that impossible.
Yeah.
And so we've all collectively been able to take a deep breath and go, I kind of have to be gentle with myself because this is a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if we can remember that going
Yeah.
forward, and
Yeah.
reach out for help when we're overwhelmed, and be okay with not feeling okay, but knowing that,
There's going to be another day.
things
Right.
that will help us get better, then that's really all you can ask for in terms of
Right.
being a human being.
Well, and it seems to me too that we live in a society that now is so involved with the idea of being really good. Like in the old days, you went out and played hockey to play hockey. Nowadays, you play hockey because you want to be in the NFL, or like it's just it's a society that's maybe the U.S. more than Canada, but very oriented to perfectionism. I mean,
Yeah.
that's my own sense that it's like that, and that certainly doesn't help on the compassion side for yourself. It's kind of like, why the heck aren't I out there, swimming tonight? Because I'm on the swim team, or I have to lose weight, or whatever the heck the reason is, right?
Yeah, and often we are seeing very edited versions of people's lives, what they put on Instagram and what they put on Facebook, which are generally their funniest, moments. It's not, and it's you get a skewed idea of what other people's lives are like compared to yours.
And I think that's important to remember, that social media does tell mostly the good side.
Or the embarrassing, but at least it's funny side.
Right. Okay, well, I'll remember self-compassion, and I'm very amazed at how much the center does. So how do people know your number?
Our phone number is pretty accessible. We have our website, we have our Facebook presence, we have posters around in the community, but every doctor's office will have us on in their offices. Every school counselor will be handing out our cards. Every mental health professional will likely have our phone number on their outgoing message, so to let people know if they're calling and they're in crisis, the crisis line's available. Most provincial websites refer to us, and if you Google crisis line, we'll come up.
Right. So what if you say suicide instead?
We'll still come up.
Oh, okay.
Will come up,
Okay.
yeah, or 1-800-SUICIDE. One of the phone numbers, if you call within the Vancouver area, they'll route to us and we'll pick up.
Oh, okay. That's good. So thank you very much, Stacy. It's been very interesting to find out.
You're welcome.